Go boom in a bunch of different ways.
I tried it out on a bunch of people, and it absolutely works.
He basically did that and saved a bunch of lives.
So you repeat this a bunch of times, and then do a bunch of kicks and see which one goes farther.
That's a bunch of stuff.
So you can first play a bunch of games, and then play a bunch of games afterwards, and then some tipped a bunch. And you perform a bunch of tests. So you create a bunch of variations, test a bunch of different settings.
Absolutely humiliated by a bunch of 8-year-olds, bring in a bunch of soccer balls.
And then finally a bunch of voltage pulses from the motor controller. They force a bunch of air in.
I had my niece and nephew and a bunch of their friends first try a room without me telling them the tips.
Now that I've taken a bunch of math classes dealing with probabilities, so I thought about it a bunch.
When you get into a chess match with a bunch of car thieves, on a bunch of porches, and in a bunch of cars,
They employ a bunch of little tricks, which is exactly what we saw a bunch.
I've learned a bunch is to hear from a bunch of voices from across the whole spectrum.
There are a bunch of different theories. Results will vary a bit depending on a bunch of things.
If a bunch of people did Meatless Monday, for example, I asked a bunch of people this question. Randomly, a bunch of police showed up to arrest this guy who lived there.
So there's a bunch more things you could do too.
As I'm sure you've heard a bunch by now. A bunch of popcorn kernels, a bunch of matches, by dumping a bunch of lava on it. So I started combing through a bunch of patent drawings for massive industrial-sized fluid beds. They all had a bunch of small holes to deliver the air. As you can see, it's just a bunch of half-inch PVC pipes, and then do a bunch of those. A bunch of stuff cancels out.
And then a bunch more followed right behind. Any of these robots in a bunch of ways to completely level up the functionality. And a bunch of other tools.
It's important to fail a bunch in order to hit that big breakthrough.
Of a bunch of my previous builds.
Hanging out with me a bunch this summer while you learn to think like an engineer, make a bunch of prototypes, creates a bunch of extra force for your system to deal with. A really stiff T would transfer a bunch of force. Think if you had a bunch of billiard balls. A bunch of stuff cancels out. A bunch of nails here. Pretty close to a bunch of sharks.
And then you want to just make a bunch of shallow, straight cuts.
There's a bunch of smaller objects in the outer solar system.
A bunch of little kids. And after going through a bunch of examples where you know what the answer should be, and after making a bunch of observations and gathering a bunch of data myself, and cleaning up a bunch of trash there as well, and drilled out a bunch of ice cores like this.
In a bunch of ways.
Throw a bunch at once.
Or a bunch of really cool BB-8s to water jet out a bunch of copper and zinc strips.
Finally, if you're down to a bunch of pieces that all look the same, like a blue sky.
The importance of failing a bunch before you finally hit that breakthrough. There's a bunch more, but I want it to be a surprise for you.